We packed a few things and rode off in the general direction of Devon. The nights were coldish, and, not having brought any blankets, we bicycled by night and slept by day. We rode across Salisbury Plain in the moonlight, passing Stonehenge, and several deserted army camps which had an even more ghostly look. They could provide accommodation for 1,000,000 men, the number of men killed in the British and overseas forces during the war. Finding ourselves near Dorchester, we turned aside to visit Thomas Hardy, whom we had met not long before when he came to get his honorary doctor's degree at Oxford. Hardy was active and gay, with none of the aphasia and wandering of attention that we had noticed in him there. I have kept a record of our talk with him. He welcomed us as representatives of the post-war generation, claiming to live such a quiet life at Dorchester that he feared he was altogether behind the times. He wanted, for instance, to know whether we had any sympathy with the Bolshevik regime, and whether he could trust the Morning Post's account of the Red Terror. Then he asked about Nancy's hair, which she wore short, in advance of the fashion, and why she kept her own name. His comment on the name question was, "Why, you are old-fashioned. I knew an old couple here 60 years ago who did the same." The woman was called Nanny Priddle, descendant of an ancient family, the Paradells, long decayed into peasantry, and she would never change her name either. Then he wanted to know why I no longer used my army rank. I explained that I had resigned my commission. "But you have a right to it." I should certainly keep my rank if I had one, and feel very proud to be called Captain Hardy. He told us that he was now engaged in restoring a Norman font in a church nearby, only the bowl, but he enjoyed doing a bit of his old work again. Nancy mentioned that our children were not baptized. Interested, but not scandalized, he remarked that his mother had always said that, at any rate, there could be no harm in baptism, and that she would not like her children to blame her in afterlife for leaving any duty to them undone. I have usually found that what my mother said was right. He told us that, to his mind, the new generation of clergymen were very much better than the last, though he now went to church only 3 times a year, one visit to each of the 3 neighboring churches. He could not forget that in his boyhood the church had been the center of all musical, literary, and artistic education in a village. He talked about the string orchestras at Wessex churches, in one of which his father, grandfather, and he himself had taken part, and regretted their disappearance. He mentioned that the clergyman who appears as Mr. St. Clair in Tess of the Herbervilles had protested to the War Office about the Sunday brass band performances at the Dorchester Barracks, and been the cause of headquarters no longer being sent to this very popular station. We took tea in the drawing room, which, like the rest of the house, was cluttered with furniture and ornaments. Hardy had an affection for accumulated possessions, and Mrs. Hardy loved him too well to suggest that anything at all should be removed. With a cup of tea in his hand, he made jokes about bishops at the Athenaeum Club, and imitated their episcopal tones when they ordered "China tea and a little bread and butter. Yes, my lord." Apparently, he considered bishops fair game, but soon began censuring Sir Edmund Gosse, who had recently stayed with them, for a breach of good taste in imitating his old friend Henry James's way of drinking soup. Loyalty to his friends was always a passion with Hardy. After tea, we went into the garden, where he asked to see some of my new poems. I fetched him one, and he wondered whether he might offer a suggestion. The phrase, "the scent of time," which occurred in it was, he said, one of the cliches which poets of his generation had studied to avoid. Could I perhaps alter it? When I replied that his contemporaries had avoided it so well that I could now use it without offense, he withdrew the objection. "Do you write easily?" he inquired. "This poem is in its 6th draft and will probably be finished in 2 more. "Why," he said, "I have never in my life taken more than 3 or perhaps 4 drafts for a poem. I am afraid of its losing its freshness." He said that he could once sit down and write novels by a timetable, but that poetry always came to him by accident, which perhaps was why he prized it more highly. He spoke disparagingly of his novels, though admitting that he had enjoyed writing certain chapters. As we walked around the garden, Hardy paused at a spot near the greenhouse. He had once been pruning a tree when an idea for a story suddenly entered his head. The best story he had ever conceived, and it came complete with characters, setting, and even some of the dialogue. But not having pencil or paper with him, and wanting to finish his pruning before the weather broke, he took no notes. By the time he sat down at his table to recall the story, all was utterly gone. "Always carry a pencil and paper," he said, adding, "Of course, even if I remembered that story now, I couldn't write it. I'm past novel writing. But I often wonder what it can have been." That night at dinner he grew enthusiastic in praise of cider, which he had drunk since a boy, as the finest medicine he knew. I suggested that in his message to the American people, which he had just been asked to write, he might take the opportunity to recommend cider. Hardy complained of autograph hunters and their persistence. He did not like leaving letters unanswered, and if he did so, these people pestered him the more. He was upset that morning by a letter from an autograph fiend which began, "Dear Mr. Hardy, I am interested to know why the devil you don't reply to my request." He asked me for advice, and jumped at the suggestion that a mythical secretary should reply offering his autograph at 1 or 2 guineas, the amount to be sent to a hospital, Swanage Children's Hospital, he put in, which would forward the receipt. He regarded professional critics as parasites, no less noxious than autograph hunters, wished the world rid of them, and also regretted having listened to them as a young man. On their advice, he had cut out from his early poems dialect words which possessed no ordinary English equivalents. And still the critics were plaguing him. One of them complained of a line, "His shape smalled in the distance." Now what in the world else could he have written? Hardy then laughed a little. Once or twice recently he had looked up a word in the dictionary for fear of being again accused of coining, and found it there right enough, only to read on and discover that the sole authority quoted was himself in a half-forgotten novel. He talked of early literary influences, saying that these were negligible because he did not come of literary stock. But he admitted that a fellow apprentice in the architect's office, where he worked as a young man, used to lend him books. His taste in literature was certainly most unexpected. Once, a few years later, when Lawrence ventured to say something disparaging about Homer's Iliad, he protested, "Oh, but I admire it greatly. Why, it's in the Marmion class." Lawrence at first thought that Hardy was having a little joke. We left the next day, after another of Hardy's attacks on the critics at breakfast. He complained that they accused him of pessimism. One critic singled out, as an example of gloom, his poem on the woman whose house burned down on her wedding night. "Of course it's a humorous piece," said Hardy, "and the man must have been thick-witted not to see that." On reading his criticism, I went through my last collection of poems with a pencil, marking them S, N, and C according as they were sad, neutral, or cheerful. I found them in pretty equal proportions, which nobody could call pessimism. In his opinion, vers libre could come to nothing in England. All we can do is to write on the old themes and the old styles, but try to do a little better than those who went before us. Of his own poems, he told me that, once written, he cared very little what happened to them. He described his war work, rejoicing to have been chairman of the Anti-Profiteering Committee, and to have succeeded in bringing a number of rascally Dorchester tradesmen to book. It made me unpopular, of course, he admitted, but it was 100 times better than sitting on a military tribunal and sending young men to the war who did not want to go. We never saw Hardy again, though he gave us a standing invitation to stay with him.